Tell me if this sounds familiar. You're fighting a boss whose attack patterns and mechanics are complete bullshit, yet once you master said attack patterns and defeat the boss, it becomes an absolute masterpiece, subsequently entered on a first ballot ticket to the FromSoftware Boss Hall of Fame. Maybe you thought Midir's flyover attack that covers half the arena was so unfair when you first played Dark Souls 3. Then you found out you can avoid it entirely by simply running to your left. When a game or anything really is brand new, the discourse tends to be hyperbolic. It hasn't yet had time to marinate and be put into historical context. I've already seen a handful of Shadow of the Erdtree Remembrance Bosses being referred to as the worst boss ever made. Really? Worst boss ever? Of all time? Do you guys not remember Bed of Chaos, Prowling Magus, and Congregation? How about Mikolash? Opinions change over the years the more you fight and think about a boss and put it into the context of other games made by FromSoftware and other developers altogether. I think we often become spoiled and take for granted what a talented studio FromSoftware really is and expect perfection in their top-tier bosses as well as general world and level design. Not to say you are spoiled if you didn't like Shadow of the Erdtree, that's perfectly valid too. It just feels like FromSoftware has almost become too good for their own good, with such sky-high hype and anticipation for each new release that anything other than a 10 out of 10 masterpiece is a letdown. We've gotten to a point where expectations have gotten totally out of control for a studio that for the most part has continuously lived up to those expectations. If Shadow of the Erdtree was released by almost any other developer, everyone would be blown away, but as standards for FromSoftware are so extraordinary, it's going to be nitpicked to death in a negative manner, with a number of overly critical videos already starting to come out, mostly from channels I like, where the creator is a huge fan of Souls games. Even people that loved it seem to be releasing videos along the lines of, I swear I loved it, but here's all the reasons I hate it. Granted, I'm sure with time they will release subsequent videos praising the Shadow of the Erdtree as well, and it does in some way make more sense to address critiques and oppositional arguments first. As far as the DLC being criticized simply as it's developed by FromSoftware and expectations are of a ridiculous standard, I could see someone saying the total opposite to me. You're only praising it because it's made by FromSoftware, and you and the fanboys that worship Miyazaki are gonna love it no matter what. And I agree, rebutting every criticism with skill issue isn't a useful argument, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to find an outlay of content of this quality in a $40 game. In an age where every game is either a 10 out of 10 masterpiece or a complete piece of crap, I did my best to give a fair shake to moments where I thought the DLC excelled and where it came up a bit short, while up front, I'll let you know that I absolutely loved the majority of it. I just want to jump in here real quick before we start on the bosses and let you know I originally wrote this script in summer of 2024, about a month or so after Shadow of the Erdtree came out. So if anything sounds off time-wise or things have been nerfed and patched and whatnot since then, especially Radon, that's the reason why. But I think you'll still enjoy the video regardless, as most of what I have to say still applies. Also, it's generally not the style of my channel, but I might make a poster video later this week at some point saying why I haven't really been around the last couple of years, as only a couple of you know why. But I definitely feel back in the mood to start making content and streaming again, so I hope we can have some fun. Enjoy the video. FromSoftware is at an interesting juncture as a developer, as they've long transitioned out of releasing games for a niche audience into being one of the most well-known studios in the world that releases hit after hit, including Game of the Year award nominations for Dark Souls 2 and Bloodborne in 2014 and 2015, as well as winning the award outright for Sekiro in 2019 and Elden Ring in 2022. Dark Souls 3 somehow missed nomination altogether in 2016 and lost to Overwatch of all games, although I do acknowledge that game's popularity. With sales of Elden Ring crossing 13 million during launch month in 2022 and 25 million as of the writing of this video, FromSoftware has well and truly crossed into mainstream status, at least as far as gaming goes. I can't find exact verified worldwide launch numbers for the original Demon Souls and Dark Souls. It was most likely in the hundreds of thousands for Demon Souls and a million or two for Dark Souls. In any case, it was certainly substantially less than 13 million in 1 month. All this to say, the audience that plays these games has changed and expanded by leaps and bounds in the last 15 years. With a massive influx of new players to the FromSoftware universe due to Elden Ring, I've sort of noticed this trend lately of people getting very upset if you refer to yourself as a Souls veteran, as if saying that entails some sort of superiority or elitism, when really all I'm saying is, hey, I have thousands of hours in FromSoftware games and I've gotten pretty decent. Here's what I think of the boss designs with the knowledge of fighting every other one of their bosses 50 times each. It's not meant as a knock to newer players, it's just that now I have a base of information to draw upon that I didn't before. Naturally, after thousands of hours, you're going to pick up on things that you didn't when you first started. I'd be more concerned if you didn't pick up on anything after thousands of hours. Does that mean my stances are automatically correct? Of course not. I was a beginner once too, and in a few years, players whose maiden voyage was Elden Ring will understand things that new players for FromSoftware's next release won't. Sometimes it's almost more interesting to hear the perspective of a brand new player to the series, as if you've practiced anything for a long period of time. Parts of what you're doing become second nature that you forget you're doing them. Anyways, this influx of new players means FromSoftware has to account for seasoned veterans of the series that put in thousands of hours to their games, as well as completely new and inexperienced players. They continue to push the envelope in what's possible for a longtime player to overcome, with each exceeding release becoming seemingly more insurmountable, as we saw in the form of Melania, Blade of Miquella, in the base game, and now Radahn, Consort of Miquella, referring specifically to the named second phase, as well as Bale the Dread. FromSoftware has tried their best to evolve with their longtime fans, while catering to new players via additions like Spirit Summons, a piece of the arsenal which I would have greatly appreciated on my first adventure, which was Bloodborne, where I summoned every NPC possible while learning the ropes. Apparently, in speaking to CNET, Hidetaka Miyazaki was quoted as saying that they've kind of really pushed the envelope in terms of what we think can be withstood by the player, and after completing this DLC, I can say he definitely wasn't lying. My channel tends to not be very controversial or divisive, as I typically don't say anything too bombastic and try my best to maintain a positive discourse for games that I love. As well, I just generally don't like being at odds with people. Navigating a discussion of playstyle is quite tricky, as people react to the topic with the same emotional attachment as if you brought up their mom or questioned their religion or some hot-button social issue. At the very least, hopefully if you disagree with what I say, you can see where I'm coming from. Clearly, by the footage, I'm playing completely solo, without teammates or a spirit summon. This is my preferred playstyle, so your views could obviously be different when accounting for cooperators, as it inherently changes the boss's behavior towards the host. Whereas with summons, human, NPC, or Spirit Ash, you're obviously paying attention to where the boss is aggroed to, where solo, the boss is essentially always aggroed to you, which I much prefer, as I enjoy reading and countering every attack, as well as how the general flow of combat plays out. As well, I typically rely more on positioning and rolling rather than making use of a shield. I've seen videos of people blocking out 90 to 95% of Radahn's damage with either the Fingerprint or Vertiger's Great Shield, which I will say is pretty funny to watch and is in fact how I beat Dark Souls 1 the first time, if you just sub in Havel's Great Shield. This is nothing new or unique to Elden Ring. You've been able to do this forever. Would this be fun to me now on a first run in a serious capacity? No, not even a little bit. I've also, since my first run, seen that Radahn is much more parryable than you'd imagine, so I'd love to give that a try with the proper shield as well. In a similar vein, I'm an extremely heavy melee player, as once again, that's simply how I enjoy playing, so completing a run in the future with a mage or other ranged heavy build could change some of my thoughts as well. I'm writing this from the perspective of being good enough to solo these games, but I'm by no means a top tier performer capable of no-hitting them. So yes, while every attack is technically avoidable, I don't think that's going to apply to even most players that are better than average. There are many instances in the DLC where your options are basically use an overpowered meta build or avoid the boss's attack in an extremely precise manner, one that you most likely learned from watching a no-hit run of said boss, probably Ongball. On the other hand, as I alluded to in the intro, there are countless times I thought a boss was bullshit until I realized what I was doing wrong, or just improved at the fight and suddenly it was no longer bullshit. As well, I'm not naive, and I do realize a large portion of players don't care about mastering these games or have no interest in playing past a single new game playthrough, and that's totally fine. For context, I did the entire DLC at rune level 150. I had always planned on 150, as if you do all the base game content, you end up somewhere in this ballpark. As well, YouTubers who had gone to the preview event where they were given 3 hours to play had reportedly been given a rune level 150 character. As far as Erdtree blessings, I didn't mark down exactly what my level was at each boss, but I used the ones I came across in casually exploring without specifically trying to track them down, so I assume I had a fairly natural progression in their use, being at Erdtree level 16 upon completing the DLC. I didn't even explore every nook and cranny and always felt like I was progressing at about the right pace. In places where I did have trouble, my character stats didn't usually feel like the limiting factor, so I really have no issue with the fragment system. You might be thinking, how is any of this controversial? Well, of course that part of the discussion starts with Mimic Tier. The reason I don't use Mimic Tier is that I've put enough time into these incredible games over the years that I've gotten to a skill level where Mimic Tier trivializes 90% of the bosses to the point that using it robs me of the enjoyment of defeating them. Is that because I'm naturally talented at these games? Considering Genichiro in Sekiro took me an entire day's worth of attempts to defeat, my first Bloodborne playthrough took 108 hours with summons, and I fat-rolled my entire first Dark Souls run because I didn't know how equipment load worked, I would say that's a resounding no. In my first run of the base game of Elden Ring, I used Mimic Tier to defeat Mohg, who I was having particular difficulty with trying to solo. Granted, I unfortunately didn't have knowledge of the Purifying Crystal tier at the time, but even so, I didn't feel much satisfaction about this victory until I later soloed him on another character once I got better at the fight. Bloodborne was my first FromSoftware game, as I said. Would I have used Mimic Tier if it existed in the streets of Central Yharnam on that first horrifying night? 100% yes. To push back though, I've noticed Mimic Tier is often used as a rationalization for defending a boss's design or difficulty if the person critiquing the boss is playing without it. I think this is faulty because that will always just apply to literally anything. The same way someone could just say get good or skill issue to any critique, you could just say, well, you're not using Mimic Tier, which is equally as shallow. None of these statements really have anything to do specifically with the boss's individual mechanics. As is obvious to point out as well, there's an entire category of spirit ashes, in fact, including Shadow of the Erdtree. There are now 84 ashes in the game. Yet 99% of players, when they refer to spirit ashes, what they really mean is Mimic Tier. Why do players so infrequently use the other 83? If it's simply about summoning or not, why does nobody use spirit jellyfish ashes, the wandering noble ashes, winged misbegotten ashes? I'm sure there is somebody who does, but the overwhelming majority seem to be referring to Mimic Tier. The problem is, while FromSoftware have tried their best to allocate for all kinds of playstyles and skill levels in theory, this doesn't always play out in reality. Many times, players go into a boss fight in Elden Ring in good faith with whatever fun build they were using, and a handful of attempts later are resorting to whipping out some combination of the fingerprint or similar shield, possibly Bloodhound Step and Mimic Tier. Now, with the DLC, you can seemingly add the perfume bottles to the list. The point I'm making is you can criticize someone playing without a shield or summon, but when the difficulty gets to the point where unless you're in the top 1% of players are extremely stubborn, you essentially have to use these same handful of tools in a game with 84 spirit ashes and over 400 weapons, it feels like we've gone too far. It's ironic because there seems to be a large crossover of people that yell and scream things like, how dare you force people to play a certain way, and ones who will tell you you're an idiot if you're not playing with a handful of the most overpowered meta builds in the game. For a studio like FromSoftware, implementation of difficulty balance has always been much more complicated than the reduction of selecting easy, medium, or hard in a main menu. They've always leaned on teaching the player the importance of learning to overcome adversity, improve, and ultimately grow. Their challenge now is to create games for a wider range of skill levels, personality types, and players than they ever have before, and I think for the most part, they've done a good job catering to that wide range of players. As we go, you'll see, while I just said it feels like we've gone too far in terms of difficulty, when I say that, I'm really only talking about a couple of bosses that push the absolute limits, corroborated by the Miyazaki quote I included earlier. Overall, the good far outweighs the bad in the Shadow of the Erdtree, as I think it's some of the best work from a world and level design standpoint that FromSoftware has ever done, with a really solid array of Remembrance bosses, barring one or two. I appreciate the diversity and conception of said bosses, as the sheer variety in design is as good as it gets for a DLC. On the whole, I found the Remembrance bosses to be quite fair and actually not any more or less difficult than FromSoftware bosses from Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, or Sekiro. We have a tendency to forget how difficult bosses of the past were on our first attempts because now we know them inside and out. But most of the Remembrances didn't take me any longer than Ishin the Sword Saint, Slave Knight Gale, or Lawrence the First Vicar, to name a few. The obvious two exceptions were Bale the Dread and Radahn, specifically with Phase 2 holding me back. A recurring problem I did have with the number of the Remembrance bosses were their AoE attacks and having incredible difficulty in seeing where their damage zone was actually occurring, the timing to avoid the hitbox on it, and how visually they obscured follow-up attacks. For example, many of Mesmer's attacks made it quite hard to see what he was doing next as they covered much of the screen, although I did adapt to this on further attempts. As we go, you'll see I have far more positive than negative things to say about the bosses and DLC generally. We'll discuss world and level design later, but we start with the bosses who are not in any sort of ranking, just more or less the order I encountered and defeated them in, so we begin with the Divine Beast Dancing Lion. First of all, I absolutely love the aesthetic design of the model of the two guys controlling the lion costume, as it allows for unique flowing movements that make sense with the Dancing Warrior theme, especially when marrying into the spectacular visuals of the elemental effects in Phase 2. One of the most difficult things in learning the moveset of a new boss is resisting the urge to panic roll and spam throwing yourself all over the arena. The thing you'll notice when you watch top-notch players is they take up precise positions and don't sprint and dive all over like a maniac. Granted, it takes tremendous practice to get to this point. I know people like to point out spam rolling and healing at improper times, so yes, given the footage is all of my first run on the DLC with no prior knowledge of the boss, I can see myself rolling, healing, and attacking at the wrong times. I'm not a big camera complainer, as I think many times people's complaints at the camera is really just how they're positioning the player relative to the boss. When you watch talented players, you'll notice the camera rarely seems out of position. That being said, I did feel like I was getting stuck under the lion fairly easily, which greatly reduced my view. I'm assuming it's optimal to fight the lion at some sort of mid-range, close distance, and attack, then try and quickly create space again to see what he's doing. As well, I don't know if it's since been patched, but I was having a bit of a frame rate issue playing on the PS5. Nothing that ruined the fight by any means, but it was noticeable in specific spots. Divine Beast Dancing Lion's Chopping of the Teeth is a nice telegraph for the charge attack, rather than a boss just ever so slightly dropping his head before massacring you. I'm looking at you, Bale the Dread, but we'll get to that later. While I said earlier I appreciated the unique movements, I've always had more difficulty reading the attacks from the body of a beast rather than a sword. I just personally find the telegraphs of the melee attacks and required timing harder to hone in. But at the same time, when rewatching the footage, the Dancing Lion doesn't perform anything egregiously difficult to defend against or would be deemed unfair, especially on subsequent playthroughs, as his moveset is more than manageable with practice, with the fight taking me about 20 minutes to beat, a nice introductory Remembrance boss that isn't needlessly difficult but is enough to get the juices flowing. I know people have complained about the lightning spawns in Phase 2, and in watching my footage, I suppose I was lucky with the RNG of this, as I didn't come up against it a tremendous amount, so perhaps that would have led me to spending more time with this boss. With most Remembrance bosses in this DLC, FromSoftware really nailed the spectacle of the fight, something many feel they've leaned too far into. I'm not going to go into details because I don't have anything specific or in particular to say about it, but the OSTs in this DLC were absolutely awesome, and this was a prime example. Romina, Saint of the Bud. It could just be the posts I came across, but when doing a quick gauge on this boss, player opinion seems wildly varied from absolutely loving her to absolutely hating her. As well, in terms of difficulty, she's being described as laughably easy for a Remembrance boss to harder than Mesmer. In fact, I'm currently looking at a Reddit comment in regards to Romina that says, genuinely, Mesmer was easier than this, and it has 40 upvotes, which is wild to me. While this comparison is still interesting given how unexpected that is to me, when you read through posts to try to gauge a boss's difficulty, you have to take comments with a huge grain of salt. How experienced is the player? Have they been playing these games for 10 years, or are they a complete newbie? How naturally skilled at video games are they? What rune and Erdtree level are they? Are they using summons and spirit ashes? Do they use 12 buffs before entering the arena? Are they using a build from a video entitled How to Break Elden Ring? The point is, don't beat yourself up if you're having a difficult time with a boss, because you never know in what circumstances another player is fighting the same boss. I personally loved the animation work on this boss, as I really enjoyed the smooth way Romina traversed around the arena, up into the sky and down with swooping attacks, as well as some of the attack tells, including the clapping of whatever you call scorpion jaws, as well as the little pink glint that sparks before she strikes down from above. As well, I found her attack patterns more linear and on beat, as in Dark Souls 3, rather than how varied they've generally become in Elden Ring. Maybe it's just the wrestling fan in me, but pink and black always makes a great contrast, obviously in referring to the legendary hitman Bret Hart. This fight has quite a beautiful aesthetic to it once the butterflies kick in, along with her sword flashing a glowing pink before striking with melee combinations. Further in her design, Romina is a nice homage to Chaos Witch Quelaag in Dark Souls 1, as well as Scorpioness Najka in Dark Souls 2. Yes, Quelaag is a spider, not a scorpion, but I'd say that the concept isn't entirely different. Upon entering the arena, I immediately thought, yep, they made a Scarlet Rot arena, but was quickly relieved of that grave concern. While she can inflict you with Scarlet Rot, they were quite lenient with its implementation here. Overall, I thought this was an excellent addition to the lineup of Shadow of the Erdtree's Remembrance boss lineup. Erdtree Avatar. As I refrained from any community discourse other than with a few friends while playing this DLC in order to avoid spoilers, I was surprised to find out how many people hated this boss. I thoroughly enjoyed it, with Erdtree Avatar being amongst my favorites in the DLC. Longtime viewers of my channel know I love unique bosses, and this one ticked all the boxes for me. This felt like an older FromSoftware boss that, while not the most difficult, will be incredibly memorable for me due to how unique it is. The arena floor covered with some mixture of black and gold, oil and water as this blackened, fading sunflower glides across it makes for a beautiful but haunting visual. The idea of its head being the weak spot is a nice differentiation point from other bosses in the DLC. It really feels like FromSoftware put an emphasis on including a wide variety of boss types as Remembrances, which is much appreciated. Given the sunflower's large structure and long limbs, most of his melee attacks are telegraphed and avoidable after a few attempts, but what I had trouble with was his root-based attacks. It could just be my poor depth perception, but I found it tremendously difficult to see the roots coming across the arena floor, especially while being locked on to the focal point of his head, where I eventually started locking off to look at the ground, then locking back onto his head, which felt a bit unnatural. Not the ones that spawn in a large AoE around him, but the ones he shoots across the arena at you. I've seen complaints about him running away, but I felt he had enough ranged attacks and reach that I was still on my toes even when he was at a distance. I have no problem with it as it's simply an artistic choice, but I thought they were going to go full Sif with Phase 3, especially as the music became more solemn and really have the Erdtree avatar limp about and collapse, but they didn't lean that far into it. Along these lines, I did enjoy the storytelling of his last-ditch explosions that leave him in a slump. I will say I'm a bit disappointed they didn't do more with the 3 separate phases, as there's minimal difference between them. In a way, it almost feels like they did have more planned for this boss and perhaps ran out of time in development. I'll give you 2 phases, I suppose, for the surprise the fight isn't over, but you'd expect some sort of transformation of the boss, especially on a 3rd phase, but it's really only the aforementioned explosion, some charging attacks, and a higher quality of hail in the Land of Shadow incantation. So, while I loved the conception of this boss, it felt like they did leave some greatness on the table with the lack of differentiation in phase transitions. R'hllana Twin Moon Knight. It's clear to see when designing many of the main bosses for the DLC, FromSoftware took inspiration from their own history, and when you have such a magnificent catalog, why wouldn't you, with R'hllana obviously evoking Pontiff Sulyvahn, perhaps mixed with a bit of Dancer of the Boreal Valley, or at least a Battle Mage version. Maybe I'm crazy, but even a dash of Lady Maria's animation seems to be in there too. As much as I love unique bosses, many of my favorites tend to be one-on-one duels with some variety of knight, slightly bigger than the player, providing fast back-and-forth combat, so it's no surprise I really enjoyed this fight. In watching back my footage, I'd say R'hllana is a pretty well-tuned duel, as she really doesn't have any attacks that feel like bullshit and wouldn't be avoidable with more practice or skill. As well, she has a nice balance of using her melee sword combinations, while really only casting magic if you stay at range. As long as you stay in the fight and don't run, she really doesn't spam magic to any great degree in Phase 1, with the magic she does produce more than avoidable. She has a handful of sword slashes that strangely seem to go over your head if you're close enough to her. I suppose the hitboxes on her swords are passing over the collision on your character's head, but it felt a bit strange to not be hit by some of those attacks. It seems like it happens as you finish a jumping attack. The ending of the animation has your character just low enough to avoid her quick follow-up slashes. I don't have a problem with bosses tracking and spinning this much when it makes sense for their character when she clearly has a twirling and dancing inspired style of combat. It's not as if she's fighting you square on and then has an insane tracking attack out of nowhere. Almost her entire moveset involves spinning in circles. Dual-wielding swords of 2 different buffs will always look spectacular, especially when she produces a firestorm tornado to begin Phase 2, which looks visually outstanding. I would imagine the 2 attacks that will cause the most agitation are her triple moon attack and when she sends 5 crescent beams of magic with alternating timing across the arena at you, but these felt more like I was being hit from not being adept at the timing rather than unavoidable magic spam. I don't want to come off like a typical FromSoftware fanboy that just rebuttals with skill issue to any critique of a boss, but I've seen people complaining about her massive carry and swipe that covers the whole arena. Most people are trying to heal or load up some massive Ash of War while she's performing the attack, whereas if you were to simply roll through it, she allows an adequate window afterwards to do whatever you want. I'm guilty of this as well, especially during frustrating spells of learning a boss and trying to heal directly in front of them instead of reading and reacting to what they're doing. Just try your best to stay calm and you'll realize many attacks are far more telegraphed and avoidable than you'd think. I'm by no means an expert level player, so if I can do it with a very basic 1-weapon setup with minimal buffing and no Spirit Ash, anyone can. Anyways, from a purely combative and visual standpoint, R'hllana was one of my favorite bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree. Putrescent Knight. Along with the Erdtree avatar, the Putrescent Knight was one of my favorite bosses from an aesthetic standpoint, especially when you combine the boss himself upon his horse and the beautiful purple backdrop of the arena. The giant skeleton with blue glowing eyes that swings and slams a gigantic cleaver upon a horse dripping of some sort of melting metallic substance is both super creative and hilarious. I love the way he comes running out like a chariot entering a gladiatorial arena. After dying within seconds on my first few attempts, I thought I was settling in for a classic marathon of boss attempts, but after a couple of tries, I got the timing of his mounting and dismounting of his steed, which was a pretty creative animation and attack sequence. After figuring out approximately where to aim the camera to follow this action, I also quickly noticed he's a bit of a glass cannon, as while he dishes heavy damage, he also either takes heavy damage or has a low HP pool, which I suppose makes sense given he's simply constructed out of bones. It's probably just my on-screen depth perception, but as with the Erdtree avatar's root attack, I have a difficult time seeing attacks that travel towards the player along the ground, so didn't have a ton of success in avoiding his Phase 2 Frostbite AoEs as well, given his fragile nature. Once I reached Phase 2, it was only a few more attempts before victory, so I didn't get a ton of practice time with his second half arsenal. I honestly don't have a ton to say about this contest, as it's a relatively brief fight, memorable more for the design and animation of your foe's model rather than the combat itself. Messmer the Impaler. The man front and center of much of the marketing for Shadow of the Erdtree, I originally assumed he would be the finale of the DLC, but I suppose it makes sense they kept Prime Radahn a surprise. The intro and mid-fight cutscenes, general visual spectacle, and outrageous moveset of Messmer really give this encounter a big fight feel, which should be atop the main legacy dungeon of Shadow of the Erdtree. He suits the blacked out castle perfectly, especially with his army of Fire Knight soldiers. Messmer seems like the guy that might actually be up here. Cinematically and just visually in general, FromSoftware really outdid themselves with this DLC, with the introduction of Messmer's encounter probably being the best looking cutscene they've ever released. I'm not saying they're the best at it, as you could point to studios that develop scenes far more realistic or with more cuts and fancy effects, but for what FromSoftware does and the art style they work in, it feels as though their cutscenes from a visual standpoint as well as just character design aesthetically has improved quite a bit in the base game of Elden Ring and now Shadow of the Erdtree when you compare it to prior entries. Obviously part of this is technological, but it feels they're improving on an artistic level as well. As with the number of the DLC bosses, I initially struggled with Messmer until I began to fight hugged right up against him, where a number of his melee attacks were more likely to miss rather than standing in the mid-range sweet spot, literally at the tip of his spear, especially the aptly named Messmer's Assault of multiple rapid-fire attacks. As well, a general rule of thumb with FromSoftware bosses is you don't actually have to be moving and dodging nearly as much as it first seems, but of course that always comes with time. I didn't necessarily like the way he spins like a top in order to track the player on certain attacks, but it's nothing that isn't avoidable with practice, as the timing of dodging it remains the same. I just had trouble having the patience to withhold rolling too early on the attack where he prolongs dragging his spear on the ground before striking. It's a key part of FromSoftware boss design at this point, but it does play into the unnatural delay in which many bosses now deliver their melee attacks. While his aforementioned Flaming Spear Barrage looks magnificent, I would be lying if I didn't find it, along with just the general amount of flames on the screen, to be quite disorienting for a while, but I did become more acclimated to it as I grew into the fight. I especially enjoyed the snake-like movements Messmer adopts in Phase 2 along with the snakes themselves, specifically one where he sort of darts forward in a twisting tornado motion. Of course, being a massive Bloodborne fan, this evoked memories of the ending of the Shadow of Yharnam encounter. I had some trouble with the fantastic massive spawning snakes at first before realizing waiting an extra moment after they rise up provides a better window to dodge in. This was a boss fight that perfectly transitioned from Phase 1 to 2 in a manner that made sense with the combat and the character, and along with all of Shadowkeep was a certain high point of the DLC. Commander Gaius. Given that the long-requested ability to use Torrent in the Elden Beast finale has been granted and you can fight with him against Commander Gaius and his armored boar, it's a bit disappointing the poor guy didn't get any sort of armor or upgrade in the Shadow of the Erdtree, especially as he staggers so easily, which caused me to give up on learning how to fight with him pretty quickly. 1 to 2 shots from Commander Gaius and you're back to battling on foot anyways. Apparently, uplifting aromatic works on Torrent, but I have not tested this myself, so can't guarantee the results. From a visual standpoint, I love the callback to Dark Souls 1 in the armored boar, especially with the massive, similarly armored commander atop him. The charging attack from the commander is extremely difficult to avoid on foot, with roll dodging requiring pinpoint precision. I'm not sure if this has since been patched, but at the time of my playing, I believe I only successfully dodged this charge 2 or 3 times, and each of these occasions felt more like luck and not particularly repeatable. Like I barely squeezed through a window I wasn't supposed to. It feels like on foot, even dodging on what feels the exact right frame leaves you being hit by a trailing hitbox. In rewatching my footage, perhaps I could have been dodging more to the side than straight ahead, and maybe this would have yielded better results. You may have more success dodging it with a light roll, but I doubt the intention is for you to fight Armored Boar with no armor yourself. While I didn't test it, maybe a shield user can let me know if you can fully block this attack without taking damage. I suppose you could hop on Torrent, run to the side, and hop back off as well. Maybe with more practice I can get the read, but these attacks where it seems like he's gonna circle around to charge but then broadsides you with a whip of the boar's side instead feel beyond the capability of my reaction time. There are exceptions, but generally in these games, when it feels as though absurd reaction times are expected, it's because your positioning is off, so maybe this fight will grow on me over time, but on first playthrough, this was in the bottom tier of remembrances for me as far as the combat goes. As mentioned, the concept of a gravity knight on an armored boar is spectacular, but as I trudged on in my attempts, I felt as though I was really only fighting him for completion's sake. Metyr, the mother of fingers. I found Metyr to be amongst the weakest of the Remembrance bosses, but did cross this fight fairly late in my playthrough, and while I didn't notate my Erdtree level at the time, it was high enough that I felt like I essentially outstatted the creature rather than truly learn the moveset, especially phase 2, given I also caught a nice RNG cycle aided by a timely stagger and critical attack. My entire victory attempt timed in at less than 2 minutes, so my views could definitely change on this boss after seeing a more prolonged phase 2. As I've mentioned with a few other bosses, I don't know if it's just because they aren't all that prevalent in prior games due to the Elden Ring jump not existing yet, but I find many of the ground attacks hard to read. Maybe it's just a me problem, but these always seem to trip me up, and while they are entirely avoidable with practice of spacing, jumping, or roll timing, I found many of the AoE-based attacks from bosses to be unnecessarily large. Perhaps they're large on purpose to force you into avoiding in a manner other than running. Who knows? Maybe it was simply the aesthetic design of the model anyways, but it was rather clever to make the large front finger the main point of most melee attacks, as the problem with this blob-shaped and sized boss is that if it lacks extremities, it can be difficult to design melee attacks for, especially ones the player can fairly read and pick up on. This long finger right in front allows for much more seamless melee combat in concert with the extraterrestrial-like creature's casting attacks. As I mentioned in the preface to the bosses, I'm well aware I'm spam rolling all over the place and healing at less than ideal times in this footage, as this was my first run where I was just learning the boss. Anyhow, I wish I could have seen the attack where Metyr spawns these eyeball-like space orbs out of the ground on a few more occasions, as it's a really cool wide-scale AoE I would have liked a little more practice with. I certainly would have locked off and looked more at the ground next time, as I did on my second chance. Anyways, this boss felt like a fairly well-tuned mix of casting large AoEs with melee, especially given the odd shape of the creature, but a lucky sequence of RNG and staggers led to an abrupt end of the contest. Baal the Dread. While Baal the Dread isn't a remembrance boss, as I suppose the Grand Altar of Dragon Communion supplants this reward, I'm holding him to the standard as if he were, as he's clearly intended to be a main boss of the DLC given his harsh difficulty, the fact he concludes an entire area of the map, his differentiated, unique aesthetic design, and more intricate moveset compared to other dragons in the game. I do realize much of this might come off like I just want every dragon to be Metyr, but I really do think he is still the pinnacle of what FromSoftware has done with a dragon boss. When I first began fighting Baal, I thought, holy crap, my prayers have been answered. They finally went back to the format of Dark Eater Metyr, and I'm not gonna lie, I felt a bit of vindication as I just ranted about it in my last video right before the DLC came out. In the end, I found him to be a bit of a mixed bag. Incredible aesthetic design and fantastic spectacle with hit-or-miss combat. The telegraph on one of Baal's main charging attacks, the one where he shoots his whole body across the arena at the player, is so subtle it's incredibly difficult to read. As well, if you can't see the extremely faint tell, you'll have to rely on godlike reflexes to avoid it. The thing I don't understand is he has this incredibly cool version where his mouth fills with charged lightning before zipping across the arena. So then why give him a version with next to no animation letting the player know what's happening? I should reiterate here, as there is an in-arena summon, and it's inevitable that some people will point out the obvious that I didn't summon the NPC Igon, or, and this is meant with heavy air quotes, I'm restricting myself without spirit ashes, but I feel as though most of my praise and or critiques would apply whether you had any type of summon with you or not. One of my main gripes with this fight is the right hand overhead slam attack that emits fire lightning on impact. The problem lies in that he does one of three things after hitting the ground. Number one, his head remains in place for a brief window of time as a reward for the player to attack. Number two, it bobs slightly up out of the way, causing you to miss should you attack right away. Number three, he immediately follows up with another attack. The problem is there's almost no way to tell which of the three patterns he's going to adhere to, which leaves the player to basically just attack or dodge on extreme reflex. FromSoftware has always produced bosses that, while difficult, can be learned by understanding attack patterns. While reflexes are going to be some level of barrier as to a player's maximum potential, Soulsborne games have always been learnable for the average person with enough dedication and practice. It feels like a few of the Shadow of the Erdtree's bosses have bypassed this point for the average player. Maybe my view on this will change over time as I fight the bosses more and become better at the DLC, but right now, some of Bale's attack strings feel beyond my capabilities regardless of practice time. Another example is the big roar with AoE followed by lightning, which is totally fine if you're not right next to him, but sometimes he starts it out of seemingly nowhere, and if you're still near his head, which is the main attack point, it's almost impossible to dodge on reflex. Again, maybe you're meant to move in and out on him more, and I'll change my mind in the future on this attack, but it feels incredibly hard to avoid at this point. I also had an extremely difficult time dodging his trailing fire attack that moves from his right to left across the arena. I found if I was far enough away, I had to wait until I was essentially in the flames to dodge. The hitbox most likely is accurate to the animation, it just trails off in such a way that makes avoidance quite difficult at a distance. At least that timing will come with practice and doesn't rely on the insane reflexes seemingly needed for the other attacks. Similarly though, there were times where I entered the arena, began a dead sprint to the side, and was still hit by the fire. Most of my frustration with being hit with attacks like this is it makes me think the game must want me to play in some super specific way if I'm entering the arena and dead sprinting to the side isn't enough to avoid the attack. Maybe I'm supposed to spam dodge to the side or dodge back through the fire the other direction. Even after defeating Bale, at this point, I wouldn't be confident in routinely avoiding this going forward. The last attack I wanted to mention were his flyover fire attacks, which look ridiculously cool, but I'm not sure how to reliably avoid these without a shield, perhaps some tool that's out there, or just insane roll timing. If there's an obvious solution in line with just running to the left like with Midir, please let me know. On a positive note, the attack where he dives past you but then attacks with his massive tail and swings back around is a really smooth, slick animation. As well, the phase change animation and explosion where he sprouts massive lightning wings is spectacular. Phase 2 is as visually epic as it gets, along with a banger of a soundtrack. I don't think I've ever been more relieved or happy than this final stagger to obtain victory. Overall, I actually loved Bale the Dread, despite going into what maybe seems like complete over-analysis of little moments, but these frustrations were enough to hinder my enjoyment even while making progress and eventually claiming victory. Midra, Lord of Frenzied Flame. What threw me off with Midra, Lord of the Frenzied Flame, is that he seemingly doesn't stunlock, which was weird to get used to as enemies of far sturdier armor and size stunlock like crazy. Not that I think you should be able to just stunlock a Remembrance boss to death, but it feels like they simply said, well, he's a main boss, so he shouldn't stunlock. Remember, I'm referring to stunlocking as in interrupting his attacks, not staggering, which he is programmed to do. It does sound a bit hypocritical as I didn't make the same criticism of other humanoid enemies like Mesmer or Rolana. I can't quite put my finger on it, I suppose. Perhaps it's just how skinny his model is, but something about striking his frame felt like I wasn't quite registering proper contact despite striking him with a beefy weapon. So for me, he was one of the least enjoyable of the main bosses of the DLC, at least from a combat perspective, which is a shame as the mini-dungeon of Midra's Manse and the Abyssal Woods in general is some of FromSoftware's best and most creative work. Granted, the woods are a bit sparse. Though I've also seen some people saying he's one of the best bosses in the DLC, so hopefully he grows on me in future playthroughs. While his combat wasn't my favorite, I do appreciate his aesthetic design and am surprised there isn't a Frenzied Flame helm now available in the game. But the combination of the Frenzied Flame on his head and in the arena, especially while casting in Phase 2, really does look visually fantastic. On further runs, I'll probably learn how to fight much closer to him, as it feels natural to leave a lot of space to see his frenzied flame attacks, but I'm thinking in retrospect you'll probably more easily avoid most of these by staying on top of him, something that seems to be a recurring tactic with most FromSoftware bosses. Due to trying to keep range, I found healing incredibly difficult due to his insane closing of distance with his staff, which I believe is actually the Great Sword of Damnation available via his Remembrance. But as just mentioned, you're most likely better off dodging past him to heal rather than creating space by running away. This is another boss where I realize I'm spam rolling a decent amount, but I had a really tough time reading and being patient with his sword coming back around for attack. While the combat wasn't necessarily my favorite, you know I always appreciate something unique and different, so I did enjoy Midra to that end. In fact, Midra's melee attacks or movement at least reminded me much of Orin of the Water from Sekiro, and I'm wondering if that's where they took the idea of his movement to close you down from. Sometimes your view can change on a boss depending on what you were doing in real life at the time, and I think by the time I fought him, I had already been playing Shadow of the Erdtree roughly 10 hours a day for a week and just wanted to get to the end. Given that I've seen him getting decent praise from people I tend to have similar views to, I wouldn't be surprised if he grows on me over time. Promised Consort Radahn, Radahn Consort of Miquella. The more I watch other really good players fight this boss and think about how I improved while fighting him since starting this script, the more I'm talking myself into believing this boss is freaking awesome. I wasn't too upset with Radahn being the finale boss due to readily admitting I don't delve too deep into the story of these games. I generally do read a handful of item descriptions as I play, as well as consume the main lore videos of larger channels after each game, but it's not something that ever really sticks with me or means anything to me on a personal level. I know you could point to me not completing the NPC quests in the DLC yet, but I've always gone back and finished them on subsequent playthroughs in these games, and I've always felt I'm completing most of them just for the sake of it. That being said, it still would have been nice to see what Godwyn the Golden would have looked like as a boss, but it's not something I'm going to lose sleep over. As well, this version of Radahn's combat was unique enough to base game Radahn, mostly given the size change in Phase 2, that I didn't feel like I was being let down by a reskin as the combat was entirely different. Plus, I love the immaculate golden armor that he dons, reminiscent of some fantasy version of a giant Roman general. While they wield entirely different weapons, Radahn's first phase isn't completely dissimilar in function to the first part of Godfrey, First Elden Lord, given the size and timings. At least they had a similar feeling in how they sort of track in a rotating manner with a large weapon as well as the ground stomp. It's a tale of two halves, as Phase 1 is entirely manageable, with Radahn giving you more than ample space and time to buff, heal, and mount a counterattack. The main problem with Phase 1 is you'll likely play it so many times just to get to Phase 2, it'll become nauseatingly boring. I don't even take naps, and I swear my eyelids started drooping closed after playing Phase 1 for the 400th time. As well, Phase 2 really does genuinely build nicely upon Phase 1, as I believe every combination of melee sequences, minus the phasing attacks and his big spinning jump attack, are in Phase 1. The only one I never really got down was when he swipes from left, then right into a cross, followed by a third slash. I got hit 9 out of 10 times by the second swipe, and it usually felt like luck when I avoided it entirely. Obviously, a strong shield would deal with this, and I've seen people make use of the new backstep talisman as well as the deflection tier. Avoidance without any of these methods seems to require the player to be almost beside him when the attack begins and dodging at just the perfect time. It's difficult what to make of this fight in its entirety, as Phase 1 feels like a nicely balanced warm-up phase for a finale boss, but Phase 2 goes completely off the rails. Once I finally got to the point of being able to solo him, I don't remotely feel confident in repeating the feat in the first few tries on the next go-around. The problem is, even if they nerf him as they did the base game Radahn, some of his moves in Phase 2 require such precise avoidance you'd still feel hard done by. For example, his gravity rock attack from Phase 1, except for now he follows up with a volley of phasing clone attacks completed with a light eruption from the ground. While it is technically avoidable, I think the amount of players that are going to be able to realistically dodge given the precise nature are few and far between. As well, the attack where he jumps up and backwards, then immediately slams multiple times down into the ground. I eventually somewhat gathered the timing of it, mostly based on feel, but this is certainly at the peak of what my vision can pick up. Phase 2 took a solid 15 to 20 attempts to even comprehend what I was looking at, let alone what I was supposed to be doing. Yes, there was a time when Ishin the Sword Saint felt borderline impossible, a time when Slave Knight Gale felt insurmountable, and even a time in the near past in the bottom of the Erdtree in this very game where Melania was thought to be a step too far, especially Waterfowl Dance. But this time, Radahn, Consort of Miquella, really does feel like FromSoftware has breached levels of ridiculousness, even for the most seasoned of veterans. Bosses, often with time and perspective, don't seem nearly as difficult as they once did, but with this Phase 2, I really don't know if that's going to be the case. The constant barrage of light ringed attacks on the ground are as if you're playing a bullet hell game, but while you're a third-person character, all while also having to avoid Radahn's dual greatswords. In fairness, you can avoid the majority of the light rings in his standard slashing sequences simply by staying hugged up against him. I should say as well, once I actually realized what I was looking at in concert with the soundtrack, Phase 2 feels absolutely epic, and once you begin to master it at least as much as one can, it is a pretty spectacular feeling. I think some will probably dislike Miquella's grab attack in Phase 2, but I thought this was actually quite unique, and it makes me wonder if FromSoftware should implement other types of fail states in boss encounters other than your health bar simply hitting 0 in order to keep things fresh and unique. Maybe that'll come back to haunt me, but it's something to think about. For the insane difficulty it provided in order to solo and the time and effort that went into it, my feeling was more of relief rather than total satisfaction upon victory. I did still enjoy ever so slightly mastering Phase 2, and it is truly a sight to behold watching a top-tier player weave magic against this phase. A level I may never achieve, but I truly look forward to seeing how our views on Radahn, especially Phase 2, evolve over the coming years. As I discussed earlier in this video, I'd rather it not be a focal point of conversation because I find it to be a boring debate, but I know there will always be people that bring up not using a Spirit Ash, not using a shield, I didn't use this buff or that buff, or that I didn't follow the video entitled How to Make the Most Broken Build in Elden Ring. The last one is tongue-in-cheek, but as I've mentioned, I've played with summons and shields before. I have nothing against it. I just don't see any of that as having anything to do with being able to read and react to what a boss is throwing your way. As far back as Dark Souls 1, I defeated the hardest boss in the game simply by standing there with Havel's Great Shield. My goal and satisfaction in these games doesn't come from dealing absurd levels of damage to a boss with an overpowered, overbuffed setup, or dividing the boss's aggro up with a summon. That can be fun too. I've done a run in Demon Souls, one-shotting every boss with Firestorm, just not on my first run. As well, I should mention, I put down a summon sign to help others just for fun now and then, so of course I have no problem with it. Obviously, I need some level of help in the stat department too. I'm not going to do a rune level 1 run to Radahn anytime soon, but as much as I can, I like to understand a boss's attack patterns, avoid, and punish. That's simply how I enjoy playing. Not to mention, I'm using Boiled Crab, Golden Vow, the Physic Flask, and dual-wielding maxed out boss weapons with endgame talismans at Erdtree level 16 and rune level 150, so it's not as if I'm holding my character back all that much. Anyways, I know people will often point at someone's build as a way to try and invalidate their critique, positive or negative, so hopefully I've articulated my view in a way that seems fair and have spoken about the bosses in a way that makes what build you're using kind of irrelevant. Moving on from the main bosses of the game, I'd like to discuss a little bit of the exploration and open world design. Bear in mind, I have only completed an initial playthrough, so may not be aware of every single passageway and connection from area to area. Apologies in advance if any of my geography is off or I miss any shortcuts, passageways, or locations. Something that FromSoftware has always excelled at, to a lesser level, even as far back as Dark Souls, is being able to see prominent or important locations long before actually arriving at those destinations. Dangling these carrots helps make the world feel connected as well as motivates the player to get to those locations. Shadow of the Erdtree does this constantly with various locations, but the one that stands out for me the most is Jagged Peak, which can be seen throughout the DLC, often framed just through archways from points of interest to the point it's clearly intentional. The problem is, if there's only one route into an entire area of the map and it's hidden in a nondescript room, if you don't discover the passage on your initial visit, it's unlikely you'd ever come back to this specific location to look for a random illusory wall. You could say just look at the notes on the ground, but there are thousands of notes in the game pointing out non-existing illusory walls. You'd have to go around hitting every wall in the game in the hopes of finding a secret passage. That being said, the fact you can start a route from beneath Shadowkeep to traverse the cliffs down to Darklight Catacombs revealing the Abyssal Woods is pretty freaking cool. I've seen numerous complaints about exploration due to less than exciting item rewards, and I've come to realize I don't necessarily enjoy exploration for the piece of candy I might get at the end, at least not in Elden Ring. I simply enjoy traversing the painting-like landscapes and various terrains as a journey unto themselves, or as a relaxing trek to reach the next destination. I'm the type of player who I suppose plays as a warlord in the vein of how Genghis Khan might. I basically just look for enemies to fight and kill until I locate their boss. I'm not the type of player that needs to find every single talisman or weapon on a first run, nor do I make great use of crafting. For me, the satisfaction is in exploring the terrain and scenery while fighting enemies rather than locating items. In fact, I enjoy crafting very little in video games and would almost always rather just buy my supplies from a merchant like in Dark Souls 3. But I know that's just my preference and completely understand the shift to crafting to fill out an open world game. All of this isn't to say I don't enjoy surprise connections and pathways, as I did feel let down on a couple of occasions. For example, I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of seeing the opposite side of Rolana's golden fog, wondering what was in there, and then simply realizing, oh, that's just the other side of her arena after victory. I know Elden Ring allows for numerous pathways to advance the game, and with some more thought would have realized this earlier, but this still stuck out to me as odd design to defeat a Remembrance boss and then just be let back into a site of grace I was previously at anyways. Shadowkeep was a certain high point of the DLC for me. I love areas where you can pull a switch or activate a mechanism and it changes which parts of the level you can access. Shadowkeep felt like a mix of the research hall from Bloodborne and the Grand Archives from Dark Souls 3. I honestly had a pretty tough time with the Fire Knights to the point I mostly relied on sneaking and stealthing up on them and then trying to stagger and critical them without them actually having a chance to return fire. I found them that difficult to deal with. I'll obviously be in the minority here, but I didn't hate the main golden hippopotamus boss that guards the entrance to Shadowkeep. I like the idea of a gigantic pet that just chills at the main entrance and attacks intruders. Also, one of my friends pointed out, doesn't the horn make him more of a rhino than a hippo? Either way, the sprouting of the golden porcupine quills in Phase 2 is pretty sick, and while I generally don't enjoy thrashing beast enemies, I actually quite enjoyed this encounter. In keeping this section brief, as I may expand upon the level design of Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree in a future video, I don't have too much to say about Midra's Manse other than it was just really freaking cool. Castle Ensis and Fort of Reprimand felt a little bit generic to me if I'm being honest. And Stone Coffin Fisher, while neat in concept, I didn't necessarily love the enemies that were down there. I thought maybe we could have had some better enemy designs in that location. The mini dungeons felt like a big step up from the base game, and there are a handful of them varying in length, size, and type in Shadow of the Erdtree, which contains 15 mini dungeons of 5 variations. These include 3 jails, 3 catacombs, 3 forges, 2 caves, and 4 mausoleums, which really aren't dungeons but simply exist to house 4 unique NPC boss fights and drop you some sick armor and weapons without just giving the player upgrades for free. These locations are housed by Black Jail Knight, Dancer of Rana, Rakshasa, one of the sickest names I've ever heard, and Red Bear respectively. While they are not NPCs per se, they essentially act as NPC fights, which I'd say are slightly better than usual, but maybe that's just the sweet armor designs talking. When I first fought Black Jail Knight, I thought, oh wow, this is gonna be some DLC in terms of difficulty, before realizing this was, in typical FromSoftware fashion, a message to go upgrade by way of Shadowtree fragments in this case. That aside, these were 4 enemies that added some harmless fun to the DLC. Other than being a way to load up the player with smithing stones and weapons, I quite enjoyed the design of the lava forges. I appreciated that FromSoftware had the confidence to not put bosses at the end of the forges just for the sake of having a boss. In a way, it almost helps the immersion of the game world in offering the player an outcome other than, okay, you're at the end of the level, video game rules dictate there should be a boss here, so here's a boss. In future games, FromSoftware should add some more mini dungeons where the goal is to solve some sort of puzzle, like in Zelda, even a simple one. This would help alleviate the often complained about boss reskin problem. Maybe even something a bit more trap-based like Sense Fortress and Dark Souls. As with Shadowkeep, I'm a big fan of levels where you pull some kind of lever to get to a previously inaccessible part of the dungeon. As well, I even enjoyed the change of pace in combat and trying to strike the weak point at the back of the golem smiths. Perhaps due to the number of traps and passageways, the catacombs specifically felt as though they got more time and love in Shadow of the Erdtree, as all 3 present a solid difficulty spike and take very careful planning and strategy to traverse. The stakes and sense of tension feel much higher than many of the dungeons in the base game. I actually had to conserve tears and resources as well as concentrate quite a bit to make it through these catacombs and live to tell about it. Never mind the nuisance that is Deathblight. As well, the nice touch of the very dark, aptly named Darklight Catacombs, which act as a secret passageway to the Abyssal Woods. I'm not sure of the accuracy, but I read Yori Elder Inquisitor was originally intended as a Remembrance boss, and I did have quite a tough time with him. While I'm not a big summoner these days, this does seem like an ideal boss to combat with a Spirit Ash, but given my stubbornness and commitment I had to soloing him, I trudged forward. The two Death Knights were the high point of the mini-bosses for me and are probably two of my favorites in the entire game. These guys were awesome. The blacked out armor, ghostly ethereal cape, lightning attacks contrasted against the dark, crazy jumping slam attack, spinning axe attacks, perfectly balanced and tuned. This sort of humanoid all-action enemy is where FromSoftware really shines. Studios that design back and forth action encounters that feel this spectacular are few and far between. The Rivermouth Cave is the shallowest mini-dungeon in the DLC, mostly centering on a blood ritual being conducted by a number of blood fiends, which gives a purpose to this brief dungeon. I did enjoy the Chief Blood Fiend, as I like when the boss of an area is a beefier, better version of the common mobs before it, rather than some random enemy type dropped in there just so there's a boss at the end of the level. For me, this helps build immersion with the world. The second cave, the Dragon's Pit, provides passage to Jagged Peak. To be honest, similar to Rivermouth Cave, there's not a lot to this mini dungeon, although the classic FromSoftware Jump of Faith, similar to the one in Sekiro, is a nice callback, followed up by the hilariously named Ancient Dragon Man. I'm not sure if that's lost in translation type of thing, but it's pretty funny either way. I don't have too much to add about the three jails at this point in time, but these did feel much more intricate and unique and twisting around and much easier to get lost in than anything in the base game mini dungeons. While I've gushed all over this DLC, this is going to be the one part where I let people down. I'll admit 90% of the reason I play these games is for the combat, the bosses, and general world and level design, so anything in the last 10% for me is either irrelevant or a cherry on top. This is going to come off as blasphemous to many FromSoftware fans, but with a few exceptions, NPCs typically aren't intriguing to me in these games. I rarely relate to anything they say or even remember they exist half the time. On a blind playthrough, I miss 90% of their quests anyways. In fairness, I have always gone back and completed every single NPC quest on subsequent runs, generally using a guide, so I do eventually hear all their dialogue and see how their fate panned out. And while I enjoy the general world and atmosphere, the lore and story itself, it's just not for me. I may expand upon that writing in a more nuanced way at some point, along with a few other sections, but I do want to end on the positive of saying I absolutely loved the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC overall, and I hope you guys did as well. I'm genuinely so happy to be back again, and I look forward to talking to you guys soon. Have a great day, everybody. Peace.